as Alison mentioned, I can't tell you how nice it is to be out and about. Actually, I can tell you how nice it is to be out and about. It's fantastic. I realised on the way up that travelling north by train to a conference is basically the pinnacle of my social life these days, which tells you quite a lot about my social life. But to be here at the Science and Industry Museum, to be here in Manchester, and what better place to be talking about levelling up, what it means and how to make a success of it. On this event, the local trust event, on levelling up communities, what is the evidence, question mark? Well, I mean, on that question, I'm tempted to say the answer is right in front of us. I've just driven through it, traffic lights and all. Manchester, over a number of years now, has, I think, been showing the way when it comes to making a reality, indeed making a success of levelling up and making a success of devolution as a key element of that. And while success has many fathers, and indeed mothers, I mean, the local leadership shown by first Richard Leese and Howard Bernstein, and most recently by Andy Burnham, I think has been absolutely critical to that success here locally. I look forward to Andy's remarks later on this morning or early afternoon, I think it is. I mean, mega success of devolution is the reason why, in the Levelling Up white paper Alison just mentioned, we put it foursquare as absolutely central. And it's the reason why we signposted a deepening of powers here in Greater Manchester as part of the so-called trailblazer deal approach. A similar trailblazer deal was also announced for the West Midlands, and another Andy Street. You'll spot everyone today on Levelling Up is called Andy and is a white middle-aged man as part of our diversity drive. Alongside that deepening of Devo, the white paper also announced a widening across a bunch of county deals and some new mayoral combined authorities, which all in would enable, to use the phrase, about 9 million people to take back control over their local destinies. These are all steps along the road, important ones, I think, towards the government's, I think, ambitious medium-term mission, on which, frankly, I think there's been too little focus so far. So that mission, to remind you, is that by 2020, not only that any part of the UK that wants a devolution deal can have one, but in some ways even more importantly, this is the kicker, that those areas can have powers at or approaching London levels. And if it were to be achieved, that mission, I think really would represent a true transformation of the governance landscape here in the UK. Certainly it would be the largest decentralisation of powers for at least a century here in the UK, were it to come to pass. And if that lofty goal, if that ambitious goal is to be met, I do think we'll need Greater Manchester to truly blaze a trail with others then following in their slipstream. And based on past experience, I'm actually rather optimistic about that. In fact, pushing the boat out a bit, I actually think what we should be seeking is even greater ambition about the devolution agenda than is currently embodied and embedded in the government's missions. So why do I say that? Well, the debate so far, devolution-wise, has principally been about the devolution of spending powers. But my sense is this devolution debate needs to broaden and deepen to include powers to tax locally as well as to spend locally. That dog so far has largely failed to bark. As other countries' experience has shown very clearly, I think, it's the decentralisation of powers both to tax and to spend, that is needed to fully line up powers on the one hand and responsibilities and accountabilities on the other to best make use of local knowledge and local agency to drive local redevelopment. I think by focusing the debate on the decentralization of spending powers alone, the Devo debate risks being a one-winged plane. And while one wing is enough to get you off the ground, it's not enough to keep you airborne and flying. And that's why I think we need a debate starting now, one sourced in evidence and evaluation, to go back to the theme of the day, about local taxation. Properly local powers, both tax and spend, for me, hold the absolute key to long-term success when it comes to levelling up. Now, it's tricky getting from here to there. It's easier to define the end point here than the transition path. But nonetheless, now is the time to commence that debate, to commence the evidence gathering about how to begin to traverse that path. In fact, it's the absence of those powers, tax and spend locally, which historically explains, largely, why the UK has failed to make a success of levelling up, I would argue. And that brings me nicely to today, and nicely to the work of Local Trust and indeed this event. Because Local Trust's fantastic work over the past few years, I think, has really illustrated the crucial importance of that decentralization point. And congrats to Max and to Matt and the team for all they've done on that front. I mean, what that work demonstrates very clearly to me is the importance not just of the local, but of the hyperlocal when it comes to economic and social development. We know a lot about the economic geography of the UK, and one of its distinguishing features is its hyperlocality. Areas of affluence and deprivation often sitting cheek by jowl. And if that is the case, if it's a hyperlocal diagnosis, you need a hyperlocal prescriptional solution to that. And no city in the country demonstrates that hyperlocality better, in fact, than here in Manchester. So when I gave, when Matt kindly asked me to give the Local Trust Community Power Lecture last July, which by chance was at the RSA, where I'm now full-time, as Alison mentioned, I spoke then about the need for a new, or perhaps more accurately, newish flavour of capitalism, one that wasn't defined by pure market or pure state, one that was founded on local civic institutions, that was fueled by the empowerment and the enabling of local communities. I even gave that flavour of capitalism a name, albeit a not especially novel or memorable one, which was community capitalism. At the heart of that was the holy trinity of local powers, local monies, and local people. And it was a model, as Alison mentioned, had worked so well in Wigan, that straddled all of the sectors: government, private sector, and civil society working in partnership, a genuine blended model of development. Now, that partnership model is not at all new. That is a model that we've seen work time and again over the centuries. You cast your mind back 250 years, and here, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the reason we saw that inflection point in our fortunes at that point in this place is precisely because of the coming together of government and private sector and civil society in a very localized way. The Industrial Revolution was locally manufactured in both senses of that word. And what was true of the 18th and 19th century is no less true of the 21st century. Because guess what? Surprise, surprise, that exact same model is the one I see now operating so successfully here in Manchester. One of the true benefits of doing this on a local basis is that you can join the dots between the different arms of policy. You can join the dots between the different sectors in a way that, frankly, is difficult, if not impossible, at the central Whitehall level. So let me get on then to, since that lecture in July last year, what progress have we seen? What progress has been made in the period since when it comes to making good on that community capitalism model across all four corners of the UK? And as importantly, what still needs to be done to make good on that model? Well, another aspect of the white paper that I think so far has received a bit too little attention has been its proposals for devolving powers, not to the mayoral combined authority or regional or county level, but to the hyperlocal community level, what's sometimes called double devolution. Even before the white paper came out, some progress had been made along that front, for example, through the Community Ownership Fund, which enables local communities to seize, control, and manage their community assets. About over 20 examples of that so far across all four corners of the UK. That was a good start. But the white paper set out some, at least in principle, rather more transformational steps along the road to empowering and enabling local communities. Those included proposals to make it simpler and quicker for local people to shape their neighbourhoods, for example, by establishing and strengthening parish councils. They included proposals to pilot some new models of community partnership, including the so-called community covenant approach that Danny Kruger spoke about in his review from last year. And because monies are needed to accompany powers as part of that Holy Trinity I mentioned a few moments ago, it also proposed a more community-focused use of the government's £300 billion procurement budget as part of the enabling effects of the Social Value Act. It suggested a community-led focus for some of the £2.6 billion of shared prosperity funds. And it also mentioned something of a further reorientation of the National Lottery's £1.7 billion pot, skewing that to an even greater extent towards local communities. That's all to the good. I should say that perhaps the biggest prize of all here, potentially, from a financial perspective, and something on which I know Local Trust has done lots of thinking and writing, are proposals around the use of the second tranche of dormant assets that might amount to perhaps as much as £1 billion of extra money. And in terms of putting that to use, I mean, exploring the possibility of using that as a permanent endowment, a long-term endowment, sometimes called a community wealth fund, was something signposted in the white paper, I think supported by Local Trust and others. Now, those initiatives I just mentioned were without question short of detail, and I would encourage you all not to view that too negatively, because they were left deliberately so to allow the co-design and co-creation of those initiatives, working with local actors, the like of which we have in the room today. There'd be no greater irony, I think, than if we had a model of community empowerment that was designed and made in Whitehall. And I hope one of the things we get out of today is some greater sense of how we might take forward the co-design and co-delivery of some of those initiatives. The people in this room are exactly the right ones to take this forward. And there's a broader point here as well, which I hope, for those that have read and digested the 325 pages of the white paper, I hope did come across as a golden thread. In fact, for me, it marked something of a philosophical shift for government from where they have been in the past. And that's the sense that local policy is best conducted with, rather than to, communities. That co-creation and co-design, rather than central command and control, is the only way, in fact, of making good on levelling out what elsewhere I have called a new model of governance of the UK. Now, because the initiatives I've mentioned, and others besides, which we'll hear about later today, because they do mark, I think, quite a sharp break from the centralising tendencies of the past, that means they are, to some extent, necessarily experimental in nature. And that, in turn, I think, underscores the importance of those experiments, those natural experiments, those community experiments, being accompanied by rigorous data collection, by comprehensive evidence gathering, and by strict ex post evaluation of the success of those interventions or experiments. Those, in fact, should be the base elements, the fundamentals of any approach to community regeneration. In fact, arguably, any approach to setting of policy at all. And I think later on today we'll hear from some of the new evaluation unit in number 10 about the importance of evaluation for policy design and delivery. I mean, to help with that data gathering, that evidence assembly, the white paper announced that a new set of satellite national accounts were being put in place with the strict intention of capturing the value created by communities and created by civil society. Long overdue, in my view, but better late than never. That value embedded in communities has hitherto too often been or under-recorded, and therefore or under-recognised when it comes to the setting of public policy. As arid as it sounds, what we measure and how we evaluate it really matters for the success of policy. So for me, that's a significant step forward, if only the start. So let me switch now to how to make good on these questions of measurement, teeing up some of the sessions for later today. Well, I hope helpfully, again, to mention again that white paper, in it, I hope you'll have spotted that social capital was given a position of quite some prominence, indeed as much prominence than some of the more conventional metrics of capital, the human, the physical, the intangible. That, I hope, was a significant step forward, albeit 20 years after Robert Putnam was first talking about this phenomenon. In the white paper, we also gave prominence to social infrastructure, and indeed put it on a level pegging with physical infrastructure when it came to the success of levelling up communities. Again, better late than never. We'll hear from Raghu Rajan later on today about the importance of that social or community infrastructure in making a success of levelling up. And when it comes to success, you'll have seen also in the white paper that among the 12 missions, including all the usual suspects like living standards and longevity and education and health, we gave equal billing to issues of well-being and issues of Pride in Place, I know topics that those in this room have been working on over a great many years. In each and every one of those cases, I hope this also signalled a quite decisive conceptual stroke philosophical break from the past when it comes to keeping score on what really matters to making a success of levelling up, and indeed when it comes to keeping score on what success looks like. Now, without any question, that still leaves plenty still to do. I think despite great progress over the past few years, including through the work of Local Trust and onward, I know Will is here, and Power to Change and others, there is still further to go when it comes to both defining and in particular to measuring concepts such as social capital and social infrastructure. That's also true of the missions. So it's all very well having missions for well-being and missions for Pride in Place, but there is doubtless further to go in turning those missions into metrics that can be tracked both in real time and at the granular or hyper local level. And it's further to go too when it comes to the way in which government themselves keep score, when it comes to recognising the true value in communities, the true value of social infrastructure, and indeed rewarding that when it comes to things like the Green Book, which is used for government project evaluations. I think on all those fronts, those are issues that remain ripe for further attention, ripe for further analysis, ripe for further discussion. And those are just the discussions I think will take place in the groups during the course of today. But let me end, though, with, in fact, a hyperlocal, community-led example of just what I'm talking about. Because I think if government was looking for a demonstration of what good looks like on that front, it could do much worse than looking towards a project currently underway here in Manchester, one which will be familiar to at least some, I think, people in the room. This is the Be Well initiative, operating, I think, across around 2/3 of schools in the area, focusing on understanding the domains and the drivers of well-being among secondary school children in the Greater Manchester area. That initiative involves just the sort of partnership I mentioned earlier on, the one essential for success, that blended model. So that includes local government through the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. It includes the University of Manchester, an example of those key anchor civic institutions under the fantastic leadership, of course, of Nancy Rothwell. It includes the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families, as well, of course, local schools, local voluntary organisations, local research institutes, indeed probably many of you, some of you at least, in this room. That project already is generating some absolutely fascinating, indeed highly granular evidence and databases on levels and drivers of well-being within different neighbourhoods across the area. There's a Be Well neighbourhood data hive, which provides an interactive data dashboard, providing just the sort of hyperlocal evidence and data needed to tackle those hyperlocal problems that exist in each and every city and most towns across the UK. If you wanted a programme that helped define what social infrastructure means in practical terms on the ground, then this is it. If you want an example of how best you might begin to capture some of the dimensions of social capital, then this is it. If you want an example of how to measure success in a highly granular basis when it comes to well-being, then this is it. And this is just the sort of thing we now need, I think, to embed and embody in each and every community regeneration project across the whole of the UK. So let me wrap up. Whether it comes to the white paper at the national level or Be Well at the local level, that community regeneration needs this sort of evidence and evaluation if the right sort of interventions are to be put in place and indeed scaled over time. And that's why events such as this, putting data and evidence and evaluation at the very centre of community capitalism, are the key to unlocking the potential of places and making a success of levelling up. Manchester, through its trailblazing approach, has shown the benefits and the prizes that are there to be had. I think in principle, and my hope and expectation is that many more of those prizes can be harvested right across the UK. And on that, Alison, why don't I stop and we can go across to some questions. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Andy. We're going to go straight to the audience, the in-person audience, because no questions coming through just online at the moment. So this gentleman here at the front, please, on the first table. Thank you so much.
Nick Sharman, I'm a local councillor and the chair of the big local. And much to commend in the kind of overall themes that you've discussed, particularly devolution and social capital. To me, those are some of the key issues. But can I put it to you that this is unbelievably timid in terms of this agenda? I was a participant in something called Community Development Project in the early 1970s, which did exactly this. We went around all the cities run by the Home Office. We collected a lot of data showing precisely what we know now. I have been part, I think, of every wave of this experimental stuff run from Whitehall to investigate, to find evidence, and then it all runs out. And it just seems to me that you're in a great position here to put a really radical view. And frankly, to just say devolution to the London model, I was one of the director of regeneration at the London Development Agency, which had a lot of money, did a lot of good things, I think, and then that was abolished. So unless we really free Whitehall, free Whitehall's grip, and the paradox of you saying, this is the way we should do things, we should devolve everything, says to me that we have not learned the basic lesson that we have to get Whitehall's grip off local spending. As a councillor, we have just lost 40% of our income over the last 10 years. Far from getting more devolution, we've got a more and more restricted spend total. We have to address those issues. And I think to then, and you rightly said, we've got to go further. A London model only covers 20% of public spending in London. We have to go much wider. But it's no good, in my view, and then you say, rightly, we've got to raise money, have the power to raise money. But Scotland shows that poor areas cannot raise cash, cannot get the political backing for raising cash. So you don't address that paradox. Can I finally just say what a wonderful thing the Wigan deal is? I think that absolutely gets to the heart of linking local government services, because we've got a challenge in local government just as much as Whitehall has in working truly with our communities. So that, to me, is the core of where we've got to build this from base, not rely on Whitehall giving us a few pennies from time to time in the indefinite future. And I can tell you one thing, in 5 years' time, there'll be a different government, a different approach, a different programme. We've got to find a truly structural change if we're going to make a difference.
Do them one by one.
Should we come to that one because there's a few
Yes.
things wrapped up together? So
I think Nick made more than one question there.
There's probably
And
five there, but
questions
we'll let the 5 in one go.
5 questions, about 50 statements.
Maybe tackle a few of the points.
Well, Nick, thank you for that. There is a whole bundle of things in there. I haven't got time to do justice to all of them, but we can do it offline. So on some of the elements of that, I mean, your diagnosis, of course, is one that everyone would recognise, and certainly one that I would share. I hope was embodied in the white paper itself.
No. Thank you. Try again.
Just while I pull the plug there. The UK has not lacked for regional policies over the years, and of course therein lies the key, that they have come and gone with alarming frequency, which pretty much preordains failure when it comes to tackling what are deeply entrenched and long-lived differences. What's different this time is a very good question. And let me have at least a go at speaking to some of what I hope might be a little bit different. In a sense, there is nothing new under the sun, but what gives me some confidence that, and it won't be me, by the way, this will be kind of made good on. I do think in setting out and indeed enshrining in legislation some objectives, what we call missions for success, that gives us something concrete and tangible for governments, indeed governments, potentially to be held to. That has not been the case necessarily with that degree of clarity in the past. That doesn't guarantee that policy will be held to, but it does provide a more powerful set of incentives to either comply or to explain when making good on those various missions. I think that is, if not entirely new, then distinctive by approach relative to the past. And indeed, having an objective even of 2030, stretching beyond several parliaments, was itself somewhat new and novel. I should say, not entirely straightforward to get through the Whitehall machine, which you would recognise fully. On the Whitehall machine, what I hope we also did is to engineer some degree of rewiring of that machine. Because as you know, Nick, many Whitehall departments have operated historically in a way that's effectively being place blind, or indeed in some cases, in a way that actually made levelling up harder. And just think of the way that transport spending has been allocated historically. Think of the way that culture spending has been allocated historically. Think of the way that housing spending has been allocated historically. Think of the way that R&D spending has been allocated historically. And some of the reasons for that, and here's a guilty secret, many Whitehall departments couldn't even tell you what their geographic footprint looked like when it came to spending and financing of local initiatives. That is now changing. In future, every government department will have line of sight on their geographic footprint. And each and every time a policy initiative is brought forward, it could be a schools white paper, it could be a health disparities white paper. The question is asked, what impact this is having upon local places? Is this actively contributing to levelling up? And if it's not, why not? None of that guarantees success either, but for me, that rewiring of the machine, that rewiring of Whitehall is absolutely essential. When it comes to Devo, I mean, I suspect we're in not too dissimilar places on that front. What's been done, I think, is a step forward. Is it as far as Andy Haldane, if left unconstrained, would have gone? Well, you know the answer to that from the way I've asked that question. Do I think that sets us down a path that we can build on over time? Yes, I do. And just to be, politics isn't my game, but I would like nothing more than if of each of the political parties now, rather than sniping, were to jump aboard this agenda and come forward with their own less timid more ambitious proposals for what next. You know, that competition for virtue when it comes to levelling up would be a wonderful thing to have happen. Indeed, that would be my secret wish, that we can have now a game of leapfrog among the main parties, and indeed within this room, when it comes to being less timid in nudging this initiative forwards. I haven't spoken to all of your good points, Nick, but I hope I've spoken to one or two of them that I hope help a little bit.
Nick, a less timid, radical proposal. Go for it. You've got the floor. Go on.
Oh, yes. Don't start.
Go on, in 1 minute. Go on. Let's hear. Just give me one less timid, radical proposal that you'd say, go, let's do this.
Well, to me, we absolutely have to get Whitehall spending out of Whitehall and into whether it's the cities are the right place, I think, is a really interesting and important question. The balance between cities and regions. What we have got to have is some intermediate way of allocating and coaxing resources somewhere between Whitehall, a dysfunctional Whitehall, by the way. I was part of the DTI in 2004, where we did exactly what you said. We went round all the ministries and said, where are you spending money? I tell you, as soon as November 2004 happened and we lost the referendum in the northeast, Whitehall said a collective sigh of relief and said, we don't have to do that anymore. And we also said your belief that setting the Devo route it will naturally lead to it. It didn't. London has been with its powers for the last 25 years. There's no indication that we're going to get anything radically different. So I don't believe this. So we have to go to the heart of this, which is a serious debate about Whitehall and about devolving powers to it. But that, I think, and this is why I commend the New Deal, because that's the Wigan deal, because we have to do that in local government too. You know, this is not something just between Whitehall, but we have to structurally change the way we govern this country, and it has to be democratic. That was the great loss, I think. The regional development agencies were great, but they had no accountability to democracy. So we have to build in all that. There you are.
Thank you. Do you want to come back? And then I think we've got a question from the table behind.
It's not as much coming back as maybe putting what is a challenge out to the room, actually.
Yeah.
Which I think within this room, if we had a referendum, let's not have a referendum, but if we did, about where we'd like to be, we'd probably all agree. That isn't the difficult bit. The difficult bit is getting from where we are to that end point. I mean, you raised this point yourself, Nick, the difficulties of transition, particularly for poorer areas. And that's a place where I think, you know, debate, evidence analysis is sorely needed. Because ultimately, that's what we need to convince enough people that, you know, we are at risk of going south, even though we're due to head north.
Thanks. Green, beautiful flowers, the lady there with her hand up, and then the table to the other side. It is a beautiful dress. Beautiful dress, that lady. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Anna Bradley Dorman, Ramsey Neighbourhoods Trust. Ramsey Neighbourhoods Trust. Ramsey is a market town in Cambridgeshire. We're a grassroots community development charity serving a population of about 8,000, which is the whole town. Sorry, Anna.
Anna, thank you.
Yeah. My question is, you're talking about hyperlocal. What is hyperlocal? I'll just give you an example. I have government, then I've got combined authority, then I've got county council, then I've got district council, then I've got town council, and then it gets to us. So I see us as the hyperlocal bit, but other people think that combined authority is a hyperlocal. Well, I've got 4 levels underneath that before it gets down to where we are. So what is hyperlocal? And just a second little point, when it comes to delivering these projects, I mean, luckily we've got good relationships with all our various levels of council, but when we go to them for funding to do our projects, which are to do with well-being and community and bringing groups together, capital funding, loads of it, revenue funding, to pay staff, to run groups, to run all those things. I explain it, it's like you wouldn't turn up your children to a class and there'd be no teacher at the front. So what's the difference between that and what we're doing as community organisers on the ground? And getting revenue funding is a nightmare. So 2 points in there, probably completely different, but sort of linked.
Thank you, Anna. Andy, do you want to come to those?
Very happy to. Thank you, Anna, for that. I mean, I couldn't provide you with a all-encompassing definition of what I mean by hyper-local. I think often, though, I'm talking well below the lowest tier of government. I'm talking, particular projects in particular places. And some of the best examples I've seen from my travels around the country. So I took the advantage, pre-COVID, of spending several years, actually, quite unusually for an economist, in just travelling around the UK, visiting places and speaking to people about what was going on. Partly to figure out what was going on, but also to look at success stories. And often the most successful stories were very localised stories of projects within places. So for me, that's what hyperlocal means. It's the highest level would be the lowest tier of government, but actually I'm talking below that. To your question about revenue and capital. So when I went into government for civil service, not government, for 6 months, I hadn't come across these concepts that are CDEL and RDEL, which is capital and revenue, and almost tablets of stone within the Whitehall machine. It was quite a revelation for me, the degree of strict separation that was placed between them. And I think, for the reasons you say, I think that separation can often be unhelpful, particularly at a time when the constraints on C are slacker than the constraints on R. So, there isn't time to do justice to that debate, but I think reopening that, or a proper understanding of that, I think is really important. It comes down to the question, what counts as investment? Well, I would count paying for teachers, teaching kids, is an investment, right? That's not current spending. That could be easily conceived of as human capital enhancing and therefore investment. So I think this is a ripe time for those distinctions, which are to some extent accounting distinctions rather than behavioural distinctions, to be perhaps reopened up. That doesn't guarantee more money, but I think the current ring fencing can often get in the way of good things happening.
Thank you, Anna. And I know it's a tricky issue, revenue, so thanks for raising those important issues. This table here, the next table along, thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is Peter Udale. I'm a Director of Responsible Finance, which is the industry body for community development finance institutions. And I think my question is really about potentially the lack of focus within government on trying to address what you've talked about in the past of the Macmillan gap, which is the shortage and the difficulty of small businesses getting finance. And this is particularly true in deprived areas where there is much lower bank lending for women-led businesses, which have much higher rates of decline, as do BAME-led businesses. And what our members do is that they are local, place-based lenders. But and we lend about 200 million a year, and we have very good benefit cost ratios, all the green books stuff. But we found it difficult to get traction, and it may speak to a comment a bit earlier about devolving power and letting people, local, organisations take control. And I'm just trying to work out what is it that we have to do to convince government that these sorts of organisations really are effective and they can make a real difference at unlocking enterprise in deprived areas and in excluded communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was Keith, wasn't it? Keith. Peter, sorry. I'm also deaf, by the way. Thank you, Peter. Well, it sounds like you've either read the things I've written or heard me speak on this topic before. So I suspect we're going to be in violent agreement on most of what you say. I mean, you mentioned these Macmillan gaps. These are the gaps first identified almost 100 years ago between the needs of SMEs in particular for finance and their access to finance. If anything, over that 100 years, those gaps may have widened over time because of the retreat of local banks from lots of local places. Indeed, the demise, the slow demise of the local branch manager, who in previous decades would serve not just as a provider of finance, but as a provider of advice to local businesses on how to structure their business. And both are, those are now a lost tribe. We do see some signs of that tide turning. We have seen a very welcome renewed focus on local business lending by two of the UK's biggest banks in the form of HSBC and Lloyds. We are seeing a slow spreading of the footprint of the British Business Bank, although that still falls short of offering UK-wide coverage. Do I think that bridges all the gaps? No, I don't, particularly at the more local level at which you operate, Peter. So I think that it's a case we need to keep on making. Despite all those initiatives I mentioned, one concern I have is, as on other dimensions of policies, we've seen a proliferation of institutions and a proliferation of initiatives. So we do now have, we have a British Business Bank, which is good that we have one rather than not. We have a British Growth Fund, good that we have that rather than not. We have an infrastructure bank taking shape across the Pennines in Leeds, good that we have that rather than not. We have your institutions, great that we have those rather than not. I think if you were standing back from that, you wouldn't have multiple institutions serving essentially the same market, with the risk that many SMEs fall through the cracks, which is my experience, that many fall through the cracks. Their business doesn't quite fit the BBB, doesn't quite fit the BGF, doesn't quite fit you, and therefore they are left absent finance. So, I have a lot of personal attraction towards a model that looks a bit more like the German model, where you have a properly recognized development bank operating at a local level and servicing, in that case, the Mittelstand. We are some way short of that, but I live in hope we might get there eventually.
Thank you, Peter. And the table behind? Thank you.
Thank you. Emily Morrison from the Institute of Community Studies. I just wanted to ask about what you saw as the relationship between the levelling up missions and the transition to net zero for the UK. Because by definition, reaching net zero cannot mean more of everything for everyone in the UK. And in that case, and we will have to start doing less of certain things and distributing less of certain things before we can move through to a new, great opportunity of doing things differently through innovation. And so does that mean there is a real risk of certain communities being further left behind rather than, as we see in the levelling up agenda, bringing people forward? So I just wanted to ask what you see as the relationship between your excellent notion of community capitalism and levelling up. Is it a question of distribution and redistribution, or is it actually that at a policy level we will have to stop doing other things in order to deliver on both levelling up and net zero concurrently?
Yeah. Thank you, Emily. Another great question. And mea culpa, I think overall we said too little in the white paper about the links, actually the symbiotic links between the net zero agenda and the levelling up agenda. Had I had my time again, would have said a bit more about that. I think it's a key link. And the reason it's a key link is because, it's not only that I think these two things are mutually compatible. I actually think they're mutually supportive. And we do say that, buried on page 158 probably, of the white paper. Because the truth is, Those parts of the UK, those places in the UK that have furthest to travel on the net zero, the biggest emitters currently, tend to also be the places currently that are often faring least well. They're in need of levelling up. That poses a challenge, but also poses a huge opportunity. That if you are to pioneer technologies, businesses, practices that make good on our net zero objectives, there's the place we should focus our sights. And to use that as the catalyst for green jobs, green businesses, green lifestyles. And that I think is starting to happen. So to take a part of the world, Alison mentioned, I was born in Sunderland in the northeast. There's absolutely no reason why you couldn't and shouldn't develop a genuine northeast supercluster of clean green technologies, running right from the borders to the Wash, which would embrace EVs, Nissan, Envision, Sunderland, that would embrace Britvolt, Blythe, that would embrace all the fantastic offshore wind activity that's taken place in and around the Humber in a supercluster. That would be a story of threat turned opportunity for that area in developing new green businesses, new green skills, and new green jobs. And in that sense, both levelling up and net zero ought to be very natural bedfellows. When we think about levelling up strategies, absolutely that needs to be through the prism of net zero.
Thank you. Emily, did you want to come back on any of those points before I go to this table here? And then I know we've got one there, but did you want to come back on any of that before I move on?
No, I'll let somebody else.
Debate later. The lady here in the front who's been putting her hand up for some time. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Helen Garforth from Just Ideas Sustainable Solutions. I enjoyed the breadth of scales that you talked about, both of you. Andy, you mentioned that this kind of local community capitalism could be locally manufactured, and you referred back to 250 years ago to the Industrial Revolution. I would be interested to hear if either of you have any lessons for how the levelling up agenda or this community capitalism or any kind of place-based cross-sector coming together for the well-being of people in a particular area, how it can be done without causing damage to other bits of the world around us. Just thinking of the fact that the local exists within the context of the global, and one of the, we're still kind of experiencing the challenges from the exploitation on which the Industrial Revolution that might have been locally manufactured here depended. So I just wondered, I'm sure you've got examples from Wigan and also maybe from a sort of national perspective, Andy, as to how we can go forward with an agenda that really supports that levelling up within a place, but that does it in collaboration with or partnership with or recognising the assets and needs of those outside of that geographical boundary, whether that's outside of the UK and the rest of the world, or whether that's outside of the Greater Manchester bubble or the North East corridor or whatever, or at a big local level, what happens outside our boundaries.
Conscious I've got the 2-minute card flashing up, so I want to leave the last couple of words to Andy. So there are some colleagues in the room here from Wigan on the middle table, if you want to wave hands. They will share some of our thoughts, but if you go onto the King's Fund report or other things, or just Google, it is about community wealth and health building, and what we've done over many years is try to bring together community sector, private sector and the local public sector, and actually invest in local community sector, and that's by listening to communities and putting the money in and understanding what we need to do. But it's a collective effort, so it isn't just about the public sector. It's about bringing everybody together and happy to
outside those boundaries.
Yeah. But happy to debate it. But just I'll let Andy come in. But also, if you could, Andy, maybe if you could do a bit of a sort of a final few comments. unfortunately, I'm really sorry to Susan there. I think there's a few more questions. I'm sure Andy will be around, but we've got the next speakers, and the card here is on the 2 minutes. So maybe a final few comments. And in those comments, talking about what Helen said, can you fast forward us to 2030? We're all sat here in this room, or some of us are, some of us might be doing other things, and tell us what success would look like for you. So, sorry to put you on the spot there, but maybe a point on Helen's and then a final few comments on taking us forward.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Alison. Thanks for all the questions. So in my 90 seconds then, let me try and take them as one, actually.
Yeah.
Take Helen's question and in terms of where I hope we might be in 2030 or sometime there or thereabouts. So that one of the words used a lot this morning, including by me, is regeneration. And the question is, regeneration of what? And for me, success is about regeneration of the 3 Ps, which is people, place, and planet. And we should be looking for strategies, policies that speak to all 3 and thinking about them as 3 that are mutually compatible and need to be approached as such. So for me, success is one in which we view each as equal. Each is equally important, whether investing in people, investing in places, or investing in planet. And where the debate about that, the debate about regeneration, is less about how we sustain what we have, less about net zero, but how we regenerate what we have. Because as you say, Helen, we've been extracting and depleting our natural capital for centuries, at least since the Industrial Revolution. It isn't enough to hold the line. We need to think about how we replenish and regenerate what we have. And what's true of natural capital is also true of social capital, our theme for the morning. It's also true of human capital, what we sometimes call people rather than place or planet. So my wish for 2030, Alison, would be that genuinely regenerative practices are embedded in all we do, whether as individuals or communities or businesses or governments, local or central. And that regeneration is cast in terms of the tripod of people, place, and planet. If that is true, we'll not only make good on the 2030 mission set out by the government, we'll be set fair for a path that will see us through to 2040 and 2050. So that's where I hope we might be. And as a final plug, that regenerative approach, hard word to say, is absolutely one that I hope the RSA, is my new gig, will be taking forward over that period.
Thank you. Can we show our appreciation to Andy? Thank you so much.